What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. I'd like to do something a little different today. With James Gunn now as the head of the DCEU or DCU, and with the promise of there being a more unified vision for the cinematic universe going forward, I'd like to share 10 projects I'd like to see made in this new DCU. And to be clear, these are not movies I'm looking to see specifically directed by James Gunn himself, since obviously he'll be busy with other responsibilities, but these are just some characters I'd like to see on the big screen at some point in this new DCU. And as a way of making this interesting, I'm going to avoid mentioning some of the more obvious names, like any of the characters typically associated with the Justice League, like any new version of Superman, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, and so on. Because while obviously nothing's official yet, we know they'll be part of the bigger plans. James Gunn has alluded that some of DC's bigger properties are high on the priority list, whether they've been in a movie before or not. I'm not going to waste a video just talking about what I want to see from different versions of characters like Batman, Superman, and so on. However, James Gunn is known for taking lesser known characters, some of these very odd characters who you think have no mainstream appeal whatsoever, and he boosts them into the spotlight, and he makes them just as beloved as many of the big staples. He's done that for both Marvel and DC now. So characters in that vein, characters like the Detachable Kid and Polka Dot Man, that's who this video is going to be focused on. And with some exceptions, I'm also mostly going to keep the focus on characters who've never been seen in live action before. Like, I'm talking about if they even appeared in a CW show, I'm trying not to mention them here. Since part of this is meant to focus on characters who you might not have even heard of before. Like I said, there will be some exceptions, but that won't be mostly who this video is about. So, before we begin, let me know in the comments what DC projects you'd like to see made. As always, this is just my list and not a definitive ranking. Also, make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these videos, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with more movie-related content on a near daily basis. But let's not waste any more time, and let's jump into the list. Number 10, Jonah Hex, and yes, this is an exception to the rule that I just stated a few seconds ago, as it is someone who was previously adapted into a live-action movie, which we got back in 2010 with Josh Brolin. And as of now, I've yet to actually see the movie, but I've heard it's not all that good. And I'm actually kind of surprised, though, that of all the DC characters they chose to adapt before the days of the cinematic universe, that we got this character, as he's not exactly the most well-known character out there. But I would like to see him get another chance, especially as it would be a great way to revitalize his popularity, even within the comics, because as far as I'm aware, he's not appearing in them at all right now. The last time he starred in his own comic book run was in All-Star Western back in the early 2010s for the New 52 run, when DC rebooted their entire comic book line. And I read that entire collection, and I enjoyed the hell out of it. And in that most recent run, it took place in the past, and it had Hex running around an Old West version of Gotham City, with the non-superpowered Hex battling either just your run-of-the-mill outlaws, or sometimes someone with more superhuman strength. And I think that would be a great concept for DC so that they can start experimenting with genres, while still keeping some sense of familiarity, with having Gotham City still be the setting, but instead of the hard-boiled detective movie like you see in Batman, we get a gritty, action-packed Western instead. And considering how off-the-leash DC seems to be able to get with their movies, I think it's not out of the question to get something in the vein of like The Wild Bunch or a Sergio Leone spaghetti western or something in that regard. Maybe I'm too optimistic there, but I don't know, I think there's a lot of potential, and it can also help revitalize a genre that's not quite as popular anymore. Number 9, The Question. Now, if you're looking at this character and you say to yourself, I've never heard of this guy before, but he does kind of look familiar, well, there's a reason for that, as The Question was initially supposed to be one of the main characters in Watchmen, along with Blue Beetle, Peacemaker, and a number of others. But due to DC not wanting to use already established characters for a series that would have left a lot of them dead or dysfunctional, Alan Moore changed the characters to the ones we saw in the final story, with The Question becoming Rorschach, while the DC characters were left intact for their own stories. But while characters such as Blue Beetle and Peacemaker have had their own modest degrees of popularity, mostly in recent years, The Question is one of the more fascinating ones that I wished had more success than he did on his own, outside of briefly having his own title in the 80s, which I have read and it's great. But it would have been great to see him get his own movie, as his adventures would be a throwback to hard-boiled detective dramas, which I'm always down for. Now, I know the title of World's Greatest Detective goes to Batman, and it's always great seeing him in detective mode, But considering Batman can also be pretty heavily involved with the more fantastical side of DC, depending on which of his rogues gallery is involved, or if he's in a Justice League adventure, it would be nice to have another character whose focus is almost exclusively on street-level baddies with a tone that will mostly be consistently grounded, which I know is something a lot of superhero audiences generally clamor for these days. Number 8 is Captain Carrot and his amazing zoo crew, and you might be asking yourself, what in the hell is Captain Carrot and his amazing zoo crew? Well, to be honest, I'm not even 100% sure, as I've never actually once read a comic of theirs outside of maybe appearing briefly in some old event stories. So that's why they're lower on this list. I only know so much about them. I know in their first appearance they actually helped Superman, and I think they also crossed over with the Teen Titans at one point, but I haven't read any of those. But based on what little I do know about them, these are characters who are ripe for the James Gunn treatment. These are the superhero characters who you see get the spotlight when James Gunn is involved. From what I do know, these are characters from an alternate dimension, and they're a team of funny talking animals who are all superheroes and have puns for superhero names like Abracadabra and Yankee Poodle. And honestly, more than anything, I'm just interested in seeing the novelty of something this bizarre get the movie treatment and get potentially pushed into more mainstream territory. I mean, if James Gunn was able to do that with Rocket Raccoon and Groot in Guardians of the Galaxy for Marvel, he can do that with Captain Carrot for DC. I think this is something you could just have a lot of fun with. So that's why they made their way on here, despite having read very, very little with them involved. Now, I will say, if this just simply isn't in the cards for live action, I do think it can also be an excellent Into the Spider-Verse style bonkers animated movie. I think you can have just as much fun, if not more, there. Whatever we can get, but I like to see what can be done with them. I think it would be really cool. Number 7, New Gods, and this is one that might particularly sting for some people considering this initially was in development with Ava DuVernay attached to direct, and things were actually coming along for a few years before it got the axe in 2021. But I hope they do revisit this one, whether it be with DuVernay again or with whoever else. We did see some of the New Gods in both versions of the Justice League, with them coming to Earth as antagonists, but there's a whole world to explore with these characters, and so many who we did not see in Justice League, with a lore that can make for an extensive franchise independent of anything going on Earth. I'd especially like to see the live action debuts of Mr. Miracle and Big Barda, whose adventures I've briefly read before and quite enjoyed, as well as Orion, who's a protagonist, but he's also Darkseid's son, which would be a great dynamic to explore with one of the biggest baddies in the entire DCU. Similar to how I said the Question would be one of the best ways to explore the street level side of the DCU, if there's one way to explore the cosmic side, New Gods is the way. Number 6, The Brave and the Bold, and this is one that I'm 100% advocating for specifically as an anthology series rather than a movie, because that's really the only way to effectively utilize this premise. Now, you might be somewhat familiar with this one, as there was an animated series starring Batman called Batman, The Brave and the Bold, where Batman would team up with a rotating cast of other heroes. But in the original Brave and the Bold comic, both heroes would be rotating, which would allow for more opportunities for different heroes to explore facets of the DCU normally out of their comfort zone. And if something like that can be replicated into a live-action anthology series, it would be really cool, as it would certainly allow for so many creative team-ups, like having Green Lantern with one of the members of the Suicide Squad, or Martian Manhunter with the Question, or whatever. And it also just allows for some good standalone stories. This is one of those things you constantly hear about in cinematic universes, mainly the MCU, where you have to watch so many different movies and shows that are technically of different franchises in order to understand whatever the newest release is. This will allow a lot more for some stories where that isn't the case, which might especially be beneficial for those who have a little bit of superhero fatigue. Number 5, Static Shock. Now with this one, I am cheating a little bit, as the last I heard, this was still in development. The last bit of news on this was back in 2021, and it wasn't really clear if it was something that fit within the larger DCU. But either way, considering all that's happened since 2021, we haven't heard much about this, so the status of it remains a little unclear as of now. But it would be cool to see this one get made, because Static Shock was a fairly popular kids TV show, one that I enjoyed, and while the show led to renewed interest in his comic, the character hasn't had the same level of popularity since the early 2000s, and it would be nice to see him brought back into the spotlight. It would also especially be cool to see him interact a little more with the larger DCU, as he was always someone on the outer fringes of this universe, but never routinely having too many crossovers with the bigger characters, primarily due to him being part of a separate line of comics for a while. But it would also be great to to have him here because of how the show was able to nicely tackle social issues while still telling great superhero stories, giving us some compelling character drama in addition to something fun and entertaining. So it would be nice to see that translated onto the big screen in live action. Number 4, Animal Man, and this is someone who I've wanted to see get a bigger role within the DCU for a long time. This is another one whose place within this universe has gone back and forth a little bit at first, because initially he was part of the main DC line, then he moved over to Vertigo, now he's back to DC with his own title, then he was just part of team-up titles, so things have been a little all over the place for him. But I've read the Grant Morrison run of Animal Man, as well as his brief run in the New 52, and I love both of them, and I think this is another character who deserves way more popularity. His powers can seem a little gimmicky, yeah, since this is someone who can mimic the powers of any animal who he's within close distance of, but this is another one who, if done right, you can combine an entertaining superhero story with not only some great environmental issues, which is what was tackled in some of the comics, but you can even get into some great genre territory with him. Like, there was a crossover between him and Swamp Thing in a comic run some time back, and that played on a lot of horror imagery, going through the sources of their powers. Now, Animal Man's not always necessarily a horror-centered character, but considering how his brush-ins with villains are portrayed in a horror-like state in some comics, it would be cool to see a movie go even further with that. So I think this would be something great to explore in the DCU. Number 3, Plastic Man, and this is pretty much the one who I've seen come up a lot when it comes to James Gunn taking on any superhero in the DCU. And honestly, yeah, count me on that list. I mean, this is one that's prime for his sensibilities. While I've never read any solo comics with the character, I am aware that many of his adventures are comedic in nature with a lot of off-the-wall slapstick humor. And if you were to put him in the hands of Gunn or someone with a similar sense of humor, you'd have one of the more self-aware, ridiculous movies in the DCU, acknowledging some of the silliest things about this character and whatever adventures he might be on, and just totally embracing them and wanting you to just go along for the ride. And I'm all for that, as I think you gotta have fun when it comes to superhero movies. On top of the fact that this is a character who's always rode on the fringes of mainstream. Like, he's fairly well known. He's made appearances in some notable DC shows where I've seen him, but he's never been as big as, say, the Justice League. And part of what makes this a little more complicated with this character is that DC does have another character with similar powers that's played a little more straight-faced, Elongated Man, who was even a supporting character on the CW Flash show. So it's kind of difficult having two completely different heroes not associated with each other outside of being under the DC umbrella, running around with the same powers and getting audiences confused who aren't as familiar with either. And while I do like Elongated Man, I would like to see Plastic Man get out of being a cult favorite and more of a mainstream favorite. I think there are so many fun things you can do with this character. Our runner-up, Justice League Dark, probably the most recent group of everyone on here, as this team only just started up during the New 52 reboot a little over 10 years ago. But when that launched, it was one of my favorite books, and this team has become something of a fan favorite, even having some of their own animated films in DC's direct-to-video line. Now, for those not aware, this might be a newer team, but a lot of the heroes part of it are familiar faces, with John Constantine leading the bunch, alongside the likes of longtime DC staples like Zatanna, Swamp Thing, the Phantom Stranger, and more. And as you could imagine, this explores more of the supernatural side to DC, so while you could dabble a bit in genre territory with, say, Animal Man, as I mentioned earlier, who even briefly was part of the team in one comic book run, this could go into something much more full-blown horror with these characters. You can get into some truly surreal territory with including a lot of characters whose powers are based in magic and the supernatural, and as a big horror fan, I'm all about that. This one's high on the list, especially because this was close to getting made under Guillermo del Toro, who did hand in a screenplay for this, but it went into development hell for some time afterwards. Now, we did hear in 2020 there were plans for this team in both a live-action show and movie, so like Static Shock, I am cheating a little bit here, but at the same time, we haven't heard them come up as of yet now that James Gunn is at the helm. Hopefully something's still on the line for them, and it would be cool to see him work off something that was in line with what del Toro had in mind as well. But in first place is Justice League International, and if you're not quite as familiar with this team, then I gotta say you are really missing out here. This primarily encompasses a run of comics in the late 80s to the mid-90s, made up of a team of mostly B and C list tier heroes who actually replaced the classic Justice League lineup. I think due to the status of characters like Superman, The Flash, and Wonder Woman at the time, most of the classic Justice League lineup couldn't be used, so only Batman and Martian Manhunter were the only connections to this team, and they weren't even the main focus here though. The main trio who this especially focused on were Booster Gold, the Ted Kord version of Blue Beetle, and Guy Gardner as the team's Green Lantern, who, if you're not familiar with him, is more of a loud hothead who doesn't always work well with others, rather than the noble hero we're typically used to. And unlike what we're used to with the Justice League, this team had more of a vibe in line with the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker, where they got things done, but bickered a lot along the way in a very comical manner. However, the Justice League International is meant to be more lovable rather than a group of vicious cons. But there was even more of an emphasis on the buddy vibe with them, and a lot of their adventures were more openly comedic for a lot of their banter. And I've read this run of comics, and it just had this good-natured feel to it. A lot of the jokes weren't forced, even when the characters were at their worst with each other, there was still this charm to it, which just made for such an enjoyable read. This actually is one of my favorite DC comic book runs, period. I honestly think you need to get out there and read those late 80s, early 90s comics, as they are a real gem. Now, in a day and age where people do seem to be a little over the quippiness that comes from superhero movies, in particular the MCU, I don't know how well received a sillier version of the Justice League focusing on B and C list tier heroes would go. And it's not like this is a timeless, ongoing superhero team with the DCU. They were well received at the time, but their popularity waned, and they tried having some revivals with both the old team and a newer version for the New 52, but those were fairly limited, and they haven't done much with this team since then. So despite this being where it is on this list, this is more of a pipe dream. I'll be perfectly honest. I don't see this one ever happening. But I guess that's not also what this is about. I just would really love to see this get made. If you read the original comics, you'll see why it's prime for the James Gunn treatment. It features a set of characters who I think deserve more attention in the DCU, it's entertaining, and it's very funny, and that's why it comes in as my #1 project that I'd like to see made in the DCU. But let me know, what projects are you looking to see made at DC? Is it anything I listed here? Is it something I left off? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it. And for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching, everyone, and keep having fun with film.